Danielle Nielsen has been at Murray State for a number of years. She's associate professor in the Department of English and Philosophy. I worked with Danielle closely when she was secretary of Phi Kappa Phi in the Disciplinary Honor Society on campus. She's a dean of students at the Commonwealth Honors Academy, which is a summer program Murray has for gifted and talented high school juniors who come on campus for 6 weeks and engage in a variety of challenging and stimulating intellectual projects. And Danielle's been one of the important main people in that for a number of years now. And really appreciate all that you do. I invited Danielle. She sent out very humbly a link. I just published this article. It's a little esoteric, but I just wanted to tell people I published this article. And I said, wow, I will read this. Cookbooks, suffrage. I like cooking, I like suffrage. How bad could this be? And it was brilliant. It is a really imaginative way to look at a topic in American history that people have been looking at now for 100 years, and to provide new insights and understanding into how local suffrage units worked, how suffragists reconciled their suffrage work with traditional views of femininity. And I was just impressed by the originality and the power of the piece. And Danielle graciously agreed to share a sort of Kentucky, Tennessee focused version here for us today. And so without further ado, my friend and colleague, Danielle Nielsen.
Thank you, Dr. Mulligan, for inviting me. Thank you to the Murray Women's Club for hosting us. And for people online, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. They are, I'm going to call them not very interesting, but we have pictures of cookbooks. Woo! We also have some pictures of the suffragists. And I have, Bill knows that there was, I think, nothing about Kentucky in the original article, but I have included Kentucky now. And so I've got a short discussion of what was happening with suffrage in Kentucky during this time, and a little bit of how, what Kentucky suffragists contributed to these cookbooks, which I was actually at. So I'm a rhetorician by training. I'm not a historian. A lot of my work deals with history. And so I'm really an interdisciplinary scholar. I have tried to make my presentation as friendly as possible and kind of strip out some of the rhetoric, the more technical rhetoric stuff, but instead help us understand what was really happening in these cookbooks. So in the foreword to the 1916 Suffrage Cookbook, the editors promised that the recipes were, for the most part, contributed by Detroit suffragists, and may help to show again what has been so often demonstrated before, that an interest in politics is not incompatible with an interest in cookery. This thin volume, only 121 pages of recipes with additional front matter, index, and advertisements, was one of a handful of suffrage cookbooks. The cookbook's front matter, as you can see, succinctly articulates its purpose. The title page includes the title Suffrage Cookbook and a seal below depicting Lady Justice with votes for women surrounding her. A secondary title page identifies the authors as the Equal Suffrage League of Wayne County, Michigan, and the foreword, 3 short paragraphs, admits that it's not a complete cookbook. It reaffirms its commitments to politics and the home, and thanks contributors, many of whom are identified by name in their recipes. Between 1886 and 1916, suffrage groups around the United States published community cookbooks like this one to raise money for and awareness of suffrage. And these are 4 of the cookbooks: L.O. Cleaver's Suffrage Cookbook, Hattie Burr's The Woman's Suffrage Cookbook, which was the first suffrage cookbook published in 1886 and republished in 1890, Linda Desire Jennings' The Washington Women's Cookbook, and MBS Hoare's Enfranchised Cookery. There were two others that are very small and I have not been able to find copies of. From the Rockford, Illinois Equal Suffrage Association's Holiday Gift Cookbook and the Clinton, New York Political Equality Club's 1916 Choice Recipes Compiled for the Busy Housewives. The women who published these cookbooks argued that they could simultaneously engage with American civic life and maintain their homes. Nationally, speeches like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's 1848 Seneca Falls address, Susan B. Anthony's Is It a Crime to Vote, given on a speaking tour after her arrest for casting a ballot in the 1872 presidential election, and Carrie Chapman Catt's 1917 address to Congress put women directly in the public sphere. For women in Kentucky, it was no different. In 1881, Louisville hosted the American Woman Suffrage Association's annual convention, where suffragists spoke to a mixed gender crowd, as the AWSA had both male and female members. Mary Britton, one of the first two Black women to graduate from Berea, gave a speech at the 1887 Kentucky Colored Teachers Convention in Danville. And Laura Clay, and we can talk about Laura Clay after the talk. She is fascinating. Spoke at the 1890 Kentucky Constitutional Convention, and British suffragist Ethel Snowden visited Shelby County to speak from the courthouse steps in the same year. In 1894, Carrie Chapman Catt and Susan B. Anthony made stops in Lexington, Louisville, Owensboro, and Paducah on a suffrage tour designed to spark greater movement in Southern states. So the Kentucky suffragists were just as active, and we had like what we think of as the big name suffragists coming into Kentucky, really promoting suffrage at this time. And all of these women were speaking to mixed gender crowds in decidedly public spaces. The suffrage cookbooks, in contrast, positioned suffragists in the kitchen, a space aligned with the expectations of what gets called the cult of true womanhood. This ideology embodied behavioral standards by which predominantly white middle-class women were expected to live. Specifically, they were expected to exhibit what Barbara Welter identifies as piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Middle-class Victorian society idealized women who kept house, educated children, and provided a welcoming and loving atmosphere for their families. Because of these ideals, middle-class women were expected to remain in private spaces, but as the 19th century progressed, their social and personal interests increasingly intersected with those in public spaces. Throughout the 19th century, as women's literacy increased, their rhetorical instruction and participation increased as well. Women had the opportunity to publish conduct manuals. The conduct manual in the top left-hand corner and the bottom right-hand corner, but then also other cookbooks. And genres like conduct manuals and cookbooks provided an ideal avenue for women who were expected to adhere to this cult of true womanhood, but at the same time contribute to the national conversation. Sarah Walden explains that cookbooks in particular enabled women to participate through the culturally acceptable privacy of the domestic sphere in public discourses regarding issues of race, class, gender, region, and religion. Cookbooks naturally held information about which women held expertise: cooking, housekeeping, child rearing, and tending to the infirm. Importantly, sharing information with one another, even in publicly published forms, did not seem to infringe on the cult of true womanhood. People could write from their homes and in private and share it with other women. And so they weren't breaking those gender expectations. In addition to demonstrating expertise and engaging in public discussions, cookbooks allowed women to create communities. Suffrage cookbooks in particular created a community that was simultaneously revolutionary and conservative. Suffragists called upon the nation to grant enfranchisement, and cookbooks themselves defined the ideal woman as a middle-class mother who was part of a larger benevolent community. For the suffragists who compiled cookbooks, they took care of their conservative community, their home, and at the same time worked in a greater revolutionary community, the push for suffrage. suffragists created a sense of shared values among audience members who may have been hesitant about participating in the suffrage movement and consequently acting or speaking in or adjacent to the public. And we're going to look at some examples of what women were saying in the cookbooks to bridge that gap from the private to the public spheres. Cookbook contributors use their personal agency to develop their ethos or credibility. Keep that in the back of your head. Ethos means credibility, and you'll be good for the rest of the talk. From the socially acceptable location of the kitchen. This homebound ethos, staying in the kitchen, allowed the suffragists to simultaneously advocate for suffrage, their interest in politics, as those Detroit suffragists called it, and maintain their adherence to the cult of true womanhood, or their interest in cookery. They tried to have it both ways. So before I progress too far, I want to introduce us to some of what was happening regarding suffrage in Kentucky at the time. Mostly 1880 to 1920, but I'm going to head back in history a little bit. And this was all fascinating new information to me. In 1838, Kentucky became the first state in the nation to grant any form of suffrage to women. They granted suffrage to taxpayers and heads of households, so mostly widows, who lived in rural areas in Kentucky. And they could vote in tax-related elections and school board elections. In 1894, the Kentucky legislature granted women in Lexington, Covington, and Newport the right to vote in school board elections. This victory was short-lived, however, as the legislature reversed the law in 1902 because of fears of Black women voting for Republican candidates for the Board of Education. We see a lot of the inherent racism come into how suffrage laws in Kentucky were developed. In 1912, a new voting law was passed that included a literacy test only for female voters. And so the women got their right to vote back, but the literacy test was included to exclude the Black women who they were scared of voting. A number of Kentucky women were active on both the state and national level. Two organizations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, led the fight. In 1890, they combined to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. After the 1881 American Suffrage Association convention held in Louisville, which was the first convention held in the South or south of the Ohio River, Kentucky suffragists formed the Kentucky Women's Suffrage Association, which was also the first statewide group in the South, statewide suffrage group in the South. Laura Clay, John Ward, Sylvia Goddard, Mrs. A.C. Bowser, Mrs. E.T. Housh, and Mrs. Sarah Pratt Carr were the inaugural leadership team. In 1888, many of these same members formed a group that was called the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, which joins the suffrage fight with other women's concerns, namely divorce and property rights, child labor laws, education, and temperance. The Kentucky Equal Rights Association became the Kentucky League of Women Voters in 1920 after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So this history we still see today as the Kentucky League of Women Voters is active. Like so many of the most well-known suffragists, the women in Kentucky arguing for the franchise did so in public spaces, as with Laura Clay and Mary Britton's speech. But I have no doubt these women also used arguments like those we saw in the Suffrage Cookbook. But because they come in ephemeral documents like letters and cookbooks, it's all historians know how hard it is to find and locate these things because most of the time they just got thrown away. So I have not yet found examples. I know they're out there, I just don't know where. So what I am interested in exploring today is how and why these women constructed cookbooks and why these cookbooks might have been persuasive. We don't know if they were persuasive, but we can think about why or how they might have been persuasive and why the women chose this argumentative route. So we know, or I know as a rhetorician, and we all know implicitly, that where we speak determines our credibility. And the space that we inhabit helps us gain credibility or lose credibility. And most importantly, the speaker's values and the audience's values need to be the same. Because if my values are different from your values, you are not going to want to listen to what I have to say. And the best example of this, and Bruce is a former minister, is that if someone is in a religious institution who is speaking against the values of that religious institution, people aren't going to want to listen to that person because the values of the space itself, the church, the synagogue, are not going to match, and the credibility is lost and the person won't be persuasive. I'm going to argue that the cookbooks these women printed were a space, just like the kitchens they were cooking in. They created this rhetorical, metaphorical space in these cookbooks in order to show the women who were using and reading them that they had the same values. I'll let you click on that. That's really the takeaway of my argument. So, suffragists used community cookbooks to locate themselves. This is my favorite sentence in the entire thing. To locate themselves in an argumentatively palatable environment. It is my favorite sentence. I'm really proud of that one. Increasing the likelihood that they would share the values with their readers. Community cookbooks became popular when women's groups wanted to raise funds to provide relief to wounded soldiers during the Civil War. So before the Civil War, cookbooks were being published. Not that many. Most of the cookbooks people were using were still from England, but we had a small group of cookbooks being published in the United States. During the Civil War, though, women's groups realized that they could publish cookbooks, sell them, and get money. And we've probably all seen community cookbooks published by 4-H groups, churches, women's clubs like this. They still exist, and they're used for the exact same thing. Women during the Civil War were doing it, and these suffrage cookbooks were the same type of community cookbook. And cookbooks have been a hallmark of women's civic participation. During the second half of the 19th century, women became more involved in volunteer organizations, just like the Murray Women's Club. I think I found that the Women's Club is a member of the Federation of Women's Clubs, which were often had suffragists in them at the turn of the century, and often sold cookbooks to support their own philanthropic projects. And so I don't know if Murray's Women's Club ever had a cookbook, but many women's clubs across the United States used cookbooks to participate in their communities, to share their values, and to raise money. In addition to helping women shape communities, share those values, cookbooks also helped them to connect with one another. Women's cookbooks often have been based on shared characteristics of race, class, and religion, political orientation, or even the neighborhood that you live in. Organizations focused on these characteristics allowed women to find like-minded people in their communities, and cookbooks publicly emphasized communities' values. And these are two community cookbooks that really clearly show the readers what those values are going to be. The one on the left is the First Unitarian Church of San Francisco's Cookery Blue Book, and it was sold primarily to raise money to help homeless people in San Francisco, because that was one of the main projects the Unitarian Church worked on there. The other one on the right is the Spencer, Iowa's Trinity Lutheran Church's Lutheran Church Women's Cookbook. It is a mouthful, but we know just by listening to who published these and what their titles are, where the communities are, and we have a pretty good sense of what the values of those communities are going to be. The suffrage cookbooks were exactly the same. Jennings Washington Women's Cookbook, the Rockford, Illinois Equal Suffrage Association's Holiday Gift Cookbook, and the Clinton, New York Political Equality Club's Choice Recipes Compiled for the Busy Housewife, like these two church cookbooks, all identified location through either the titles or their authorship. Cookbooks also included advertisements from local businesses that helped them identify the communities they were working in. The Equal Suffrage League's Suffrage Cookbook promoted advertisers like Carl Heberlein, Burnham's Art and Stationery Shop. So the Detroit Creamery Milk, which can be bought at best groceries, lunchrooms, and cafes, and Burnham's Art and Stationery Shop, complete with circulating library, were two ads featured in the Suffrage Cookbook from the Detroit women. The compilers of this cookbook informed readers of their careful selection of the ads themselves, writing, as in the body of this book, careful selection has been made to include only well-tried and proven recipes. So in the advertising pages, like care has been taken to include only high-class companies and commodities of proven worth and value. With phrases like high-class companies and commodities of proven worth and value, the advertisement's preface indicated the socioeconomic status and location of the intended audiences. Advertisers like a caterer, an electric store, which sold electric appliances, and the stationery shop and lend and circulating library, all identified not only middle-class users, but also people who lived in Detroit. Travelers aren't going to stop at a circulating library or need a caterer or buy electric appliances. These are people who lived in Detroit. So we know that this cookbook pretty much stayed in Detroit and was for suffragists in Detroit. But not all cookbooks were limited to their local audiences, and suffrage cookbooks were no exception, especially given the international and at this time national and international British suffragists were also fighting for the vote at the exact same time. Burr's Women's Suffrage Group, which is where the other two advertisements come from, indicated that while the cookbooks supported the Boston-based groups, which is where Burr lived, the suffrage question was international. The title page indicated its sales were in aid of the Festival and Bazaar, December 13th through the 19th, 1886, and the Country Store, when the second edition got printed in 1890. The cookbook, however, included contributors from a number of states and England, so it was international in scope. Alongside this list of contributors were three advertisements: subscription information for the Women's Journal, which is that third picture here, which was the official newspaper of the American Women's Suffrage Association, and included testimonials from Louisa May Alcott, Clara Barton, and Frances Willard, names you may recognize, and mailing information for women's suffrage tracts, so you could go hand out your tracts to your friends, also published by the Women's Journal. Similarly, Kleber's Suffrage Cookbook, and it also included the McGee Standard and Mystic Ranges, which, while they are based in Boston, are available at, I can't remember the exact wording, but fine stores throughout the nation. So they were promoting a local business, but saying, you can buy our McGee ranges wherever you might buy excellent home goods in your own town. And so the Burr's cookbook was definitely more national than the Detroit suffragists cookbook. And we can tell that through the advertisements that they chose to include in their cookbook. But we also know that these cookbooks included recipes from people around the nation. And yay, we have a Kentucky connection, and I'm pretty excited about this. Desha Breckenridge, who was the editor of the Lexington Herald, submitted a recipe for baked ham. His wife, Madeline McDowell Breckenridge, was a leading suffragist in Kentucky. Interestingly, and I thought about whether or not this baked ham recipe was actually his or not. They were very clear in the cookbook. Right below this recipe is a portrait of Madeline McDowell Breckenridge, and they label the portrait as Mrs. Desha Breckenridge. But you'll notice that they only give the baked ham recipe to him. And so I'm going to take this as his. Another recipe we see in this cookbook is from Jack London. He submitted a recipe for roasted duck breast and another recipe for crispy celery, which he suggested to be served alongside of that roasted duck breast. And his recipes are also signed by Jack London. And he and his wife were both suffragists as well. They were living in California at the time. And Kentucky author Irvin Cobb did not submit a recipe, at least one that was assigned to him, but he does have a letter in favor of women's suffrage. And right below his letter is included his portrait, and it's signed, yours sincerely, Irvin S. Cobb. And so he was in New York at this time, but was still very much connected to Kentucky. And so we can see how Kentucky suffragists, or those people connected to Kentucky, were finding a space in these suffrage cookbooks. So these cookbooks exhibited the main components of community cookbooks, and illustrated why suffragists might have turned to this genre. First, they highlighted women's communities and they brought women together. They allowed women to be part of civic society. And as I'm going to talk about next, cookbooks created a rhetorical space, that safe space where they could talk and be experts and people could trust them. So during the fight for suffrage, suffragists developed two types of arguments: justice arguments, women and men are equal, women and men should have equal rights. Those arguments did not work very well. People did not believe men and women are equal. They were not persuasive. So women turned to what get called expediency arguments. The expediency arguments were basically, women are better and more moral than men, and in order to have a more moral society, women need to be able to vote. These expediency arguments are actually what were more persuasive, because it allowed women to take the role of being the moral arbiters of the house, which they already were expected to be through that cult of true womanhood, and by not claiming equality with men. They could be more moral, they just could not be equal. And we're going to look at some examples of how the cookbook authors put that into play. These expediency arguments also put women directly in conversation with the antis, or those people who were against women's suffrage, because the antis argued that women should not be active in the political sphere because it might allow them, one, to engage in conversations that women don't belong in, like conversations of war, even though their brothers and husbands and male relatives were dying in wars and they were acting as nurses in wars that somehow did not affect women. But also that they should only be concerned with things like the pure food movement or the temperance movement, because those were things that directly affected women. Also, ironically, put the antis in the public sphere talking about topics, but I have yet to find anyone explaining how exactly they were able to muddle their way through that logic. I enjoy the irony of it all. One thing that the antis argued was that suffragists would stop cooking for their families. They literally argued that if women got the right to vote, they would spend all of their time campaigning and leave their husbands and children at home to starve. So the cookbook authors said, but wait, of course we're not going to leave our children and husbands home to starve. We cook, we have cookbooks. We're giving you the ability to both vote and cook. And the opening epigraph of the Washington Women's Cookbook is, give us the vote and we will cook, the better for a wide outlook. So they directly linked suffrage with the cooking quality and explicitly linked women's responsibilities to the suffrage movement, basically telling people, hey, if you let us be more involved, you're going to get better food at home, something we should all want. In addition to arguing suffrage would improve the home, suffragists used women's growing philanthropic participation in moral and social concerns to advocate for the relationship between cooking and good citizenship practices. Another thing that was really important at that time. In the Suffrage Cookbook's introduction, Erasmus Wilson, who was a columnist known as the Quiet Observer and in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, connected eating, citizenship, and success of the nation. And I'm going to quote Wilson at length because he has some interesting things to say. Eating and drinking are so essential to our living and to our usefulness, and so directly involved with our future state, that these must be classed with our sacred duties. Hence the necessity for so educating the children that they will know how to live and how to develop into hale, hearty, and wholesome men and women, thus ensuring the best possible social and political conditions for the people of this country. Suffragists, male and female alike, made their argument clear. Good housekeeping and good homemakers educated children and served their families healthy foods. In turn, these healthy families and these healthy children turned into good citizens. If you feed children well, they will be good citizens, the nation will be healthy. In contrast to what the antis argued, which was, if you vote, you won't feed your children and the nation will suffer. So the suffragists writing the cookbooks and the antis are at direct odds. And that's why the expediency arguments and not the justice arguments for equal rights worked. So it's important to note that these cookbooks very much foregrounded a middle-class white view of society. And this happened with almost all community cookbooks. And noted suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were, well, to put it bluntly, very racist and believed that women of color should not get the vote at the same time as white women. And even after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, Indigenous Americans and those of Chinese descent did not gain the right to vote until 1924 and 1943, respectively. And so even though this fight seemed to be for equal suffrage, we know that it left out people of color. And we know that literacy tests and Jim Crow laws and poll taxes made it even more difficult for people of color to vote after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And historian Molly Mann notes that the dominance of white and affluent women's voices in suffrage cookbooks and hunger strikes. And Megan Elias explains that the community cookbooks in particular shared a palate, a set of flavors, and a methodology that allows us to see what a large number of white middle-class people were eating, and not really women of color. And so though this feels really wide-ranging, it was still a very middle-class white women's world, and how they argued and what they argued for were really prevalent. Because these cookbooks catered to white middle-class families in America, their uses would have varied. Some of these cookbooks would have been used by wives and mothers themselves. Some of them may have had labor in the house, cooking and cleaning for them. But all of the cookbooks talk about in their introductions how these should be used by families, going back to that argument that these cookbooks are designed to create healthy families. These cookbooks are designed for women who want to feed and their families and take care of their children and take care of their husbands. Erasmus Wilson anticipates the suffrage cookbook to be used by families, explaining that because women are the home keepers and the natural guardian of the children, it's important that they be made familiar with the culinary arts so they may be entirely competent to lead coming generations in the paths of health and happiness. And Burr writes that each recipe, though not original, has been thoroughly tested and is vouched for as reliable by the contributor whose name is appended. So they really wanted to make sure that people understood these recipes weren't just thrown together, but they were trustworthy. They were recipes that you should and could cook from. And if we want to, during the question and answer, I actually have a couple of recipes on a slide, and we can look at how the recipes differ and what they tell us about American food culture at that time. The cookbook's ancillary materials also articulated these middle-class values. In the first sentences of the preface to the Women's Suffrage Cookbook, Burr explained that this volume is sent out with an important mission. It has been carefully prepared and will prove a practical, reliable authority on cookery, housekeeping, and care of the sick, especially adapted to family use. In this excerpt here, she signals the domestic values she and the contributor shared with their audience. The cookbook's important mission was not to encourage suffrage. Rather, it was designed to be a reliable authority for women's domestic duties, especially adapted to family use. Similarly, the Washington Women's Cookbook preface reminded readers, cooking represents the evolution of civilized life, and the recipes in the cookbook represented science, art, and the human desire to produce things beautiful. The civilized life, according to Jennings, corresponded with home, a smiling woman, and a good dinner. Because does not the heart of man yearn toward this trio at evening time? Burr and Jennings are speaking directly to those fears of the aunties. That women who voted would desert their families. To quell that fear, then, they showed suffragists and their cookbooks to not be about suffrage. Instead, they were about taking care of the family. So why are these cookbooks persuasive? So not only did they affirm communal values, but they spoke from a place where women were expected to be. The kitchen, the home. Those who feared suffrage meant abandoning domesticity saw suffragists working within the expected boundaries through these cookbooks. Cindy Koenig-Richards explains that the Washington Women's Cookbook publicized political views together with pragmatic information and regional norms. As such, it generated interest and participation, even from women who did not identify themselves as suffragists. And if we think the Detroit Creamery or Lending Library was local, the Washington Women's Cookbook included recipes for things like seal heart and shark tail. Things that we in Kentucky are probably not going to cook anytime soon, but for women in Washington, were really important things to have. This highly local information makes it clear that the compilers are part of the community. They are not outsiders coming in to agitate. They are homegrown and very much want this for their community. This regional information was situated beside pro-suffragist epigraphs, like Alice Stone Blackwell's assertion that women should vote because it is fair and right that those who must obey the laws should have a voice in making them, which opens the beverages chapter. The ancillary materials reminded readers that as voters, women would contribute to the public good. The epigraph to the vegetables chapter asked, what is politics? Why, it's housekeeping on a big scale. The government is in a muddle because it has been trying to do the housekeeping without the women. Jane Addams compares voting and women's work at the beginning of the dessert chapter. Addams writes, women do not ask for the ballot as a right or a privilege, but the social and political conditions of today make it necessary that women be given the ballot to do their work in the world as they have always done. Both of these epigraphs suggested politics is not a separate sphere from which women should be forbidden. Rather, it's a space where women belonged and were needed to fix problems addressed through political mechanisms. If the epigraphs argued it was enough for women to be expected to keep house, feed and care for the sick, and ensure the health and safety of others, then women had the responsibility to do those exact same things on a national scale. Moreover, these arguments directly refuted those justice arguments. The ballot was not a right or a privilege. Instead, it's an obligation akin to domestic duties. To shirk suffrage was to leave one's duties unfulfilled. By putting forth the women's responsibilities to maintain the nation and to do their work in the world as they have always done, suffragists invented this rhetorical space in these cookbooks from which they could develop credibility, that ethos I mentioned at the beginning. And community cookbooks provided a structure from which they could serve their purposes. The genre was there, and they simply adapted and used it. Specifically, they could work within the cult of true womanhood to demonstrate their continued domesticity while creating a space for themselves as experts, and contribute to civic life by extending housekeeping to the public sphere, whether that was through Adams' assertion that women were already doing their work, the idea that politics was simply housekeeping on a larger scale, or that women as civic participants would ensure clean food, safe working conditions, and youth labor laws, which they were all working towards at the exact same time. By the end of the suffrage fight, suffragists and their advocates had realized that arguments for equal rights were not particularly effective. This did not mean, however, that they gave up the fight. Instead, they used their rhetorical agency, the power they had, their expertise as wives and mothers and housekeepers to publish these cookbooks. And instead of arguing to be treated equally, these women worked from that Victorian expectation of piety, purity, submissiveness, and that women were more morally sound than their male partners, arguing if women could vote, the nation as a whole would be healthier, both morally and physically. Wendy Scherer reminds readers that in the final years of the suffrage battle, suffragists justified political activism by linking it to the protection of the home, and that this practice was a common rhetorical tactic for women's political groups. Because they argued, the causes around which they organized were not political, but moral, and within the women's purview. Suffragists invented rhetorical spaces that drew from the community's shared values, whether those shared values were those influenced by the cult of true womanhood or the values informed by women's suffrage. This rhetorical space allowed women to speak to shared community values without alienating those readers who may not fully approve of the women's involvement in public spaces. So let's look at these. I had this in until the very end, and it was like an hour long, and I'm like, no, I can't do that. So these are multiple recipes for brown bread. The one has 3 recipes for brown bread. And the 3 are from Patty Burr's Women's Suffrage Cookbook, and the one on the right is from the Detroit Suffragists. But there's just some really cool things you can see here. So these are published about 35 years apart. So we can see a lot of things that are really interesting in terms of how cookbooks developed. So the one on the left, you'll notice they're just paragraphs. And you have to know a lot about cooking in order to be able to pull these recipes off. So Mrs. Zilpha Spooners in the middle tells us 2 cups of Indian meal, which is cornmeal, 2 cups of rye meal, 1 cup of flour, 1 large cup, whatever that means, of molasses, a teaspoonful of soda, mixed with soft warm water. How much? Who knows? And steam for 5 hours. So this loaf of bread is going to produce a pretty hearty loaf of